Hello, students. This is Professor Karasi with, I want to say nine. Yeah, with chapter nine, for cognitive psychology. Some of this is going to be reiterated, based on other things we've talked about. But decision making is super important, as we know, and as we've also kind of discussed, in my opinion. Um, So representativeness, humans pay particular attention to stimuli that are salient, things that are unique, negative, colorful, bright, and moving. In many cases, we base our judgments on information that seems to represent or match what we expect will happen. When we do so, we are using the representativeness heuristic. Availability, oops, oh no, yikes, yikes, it's going by itself. That was strange. Okay, availability. Although which characteristics we use to think about objects or people is determined in part by the salience of their characteristics, individual differences in the person who is doing the judging are also important. People vary in the schemas that they find important to use when judging others and often thinking about themselves. One way to consider this importance is in terms of the cognitive accessibility of the schema. Cognitive accessibility refers to the extent to which a schema is activated in memory and thus likely be used to process information. Because we rely so heavily on our schemas and attitudes, and particularly on those that are salient and accessible, we can sometimes be overly influenced by them, which is the truth. Imagine, for instance, that I asked you to close your eyes and determine whether there are more words in the English language that begin with the letter R or that have the letter R as the third letter. You would probably try to solve this problem by thinking of words that have each characteristic. It turns out that most people think there are more words that begin with R, even though there are, in fact, more words that have an R as a third letter. And that's human nature. Whenever I'm asked that question, I immediately start thinking of words that begin with an R versus R's as a third letter. Anchoring. The basic idea of anchoring is that when we're making a numerical estimate, we're often biased by the number we start at. Um, in the case of Mount Everest estimate, I gave you the starting point of 150 feet. You, though, well, it's taller than that. So you likely adjusted the estimate from 150 feet to something taller than that. The tricky thing, though, is that we don't often adjust far enough from the anchor, which is true. Um, and sometimes when somebody throws an anchor out there, it may or may not be accurate. So they're giving us an inaccurate starting point, and we're usually assuming that we have to go down or up from there. So we have to have reliable anchors. In another example, let's see. I want to see where they discuss the gambling. They don't. But sometimes people will create anchors in gambling process. So for instance, if a person is on a slot machine where there's a variable um, reinforcement schedule, meaning you never know when it's going to hit. There's no rhyme or reason to it. You can't count the number of uh, hits or the length of time that you're sitting there. It's all variable. But people sometimes think, okay, well, if I sat here for this long, or if I attempted this many times, then that's my anchor. So within the next 15 spins, I should win something. That's all fallaciously built because something like a slot machine, something like a table game really is all based on luck and variation as opposed to any kind of consistency moving forward or backward from an anchor. These are examples of studies that would be interesting to read about involving anchors. The sunk cost effect is a term used in economics referring to non-recoverable investments of time or money. The trap occurs when a person's aversion to loss impels them to throw good money after bad because they don't want to waste their earlier investment. Okay. This is vulnerable to manipulation. The more time and energy a cult recruit can be persuaded to spend with the group, the more invested they feel. Okay, so this is when, let's look at it from an economic perspective. If someone asked you to invest in something, whether that be a company or a product or something, and they say, okay, for $500, I can do this. And then you give them $500 and then they need more money. And at that point, you feel more committed because you've already given them $500 of your money. So you're more inclined to give them $2,000 because you think of, well, I've already invested this. I don't want to lose that investment. So you keep kind of upping the ante of investing money, and you might be left with nothing at the end of the day, which is actually very distressing. Hindsight bias is the opposite of overconfidence bias, as it occurs when looking backward in time where mistakes made seem may seem obvious after they have already occurred. In other words, after a surprising event occurred, many individuals are likely to think that they already knew what was going to happen. And I talked to you about that yesterday with one of the other chapters where people, I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, hindsight is 2020. Anyone can say they knew the solution to a problem after it's all kind of shaken out and transpired. But people do have a tendency on using the hindsight bias rather frequently. Illusory correlations we talked about in the previous chapter. Again, it's drawing a relationship between two or more things where there actually isn't a relationship, but thinking there is because of some premise. Confirmation bias we spoke about. Oops. Okay. You can read about overconfidence, but I want you to think about how overconfidence can affect decision-making processes. Because sometimes when a person is overconfident in their decision-making ability, per se, they don't look at all of the details. They just feel as though they have the ability to make a sound decision, and they might be more inclined to make that decision rather quickly because of overconfidence. I would, let's see. And I would recommend reading this last case study. I know they give you a lot of them and they're kind of overwhelming, but this one about Jennifer Thompson in 1984, I think this is worth your read and analysis. And I think that's the end of that chapter. So for this chapter, I want you to think about, again, always relate to you in your life. You know, what goes into your decision-making process, what gets in the way of making informed decisions. Have you ever committed the self-conf or the confirmation bias, which we all truly have, where we're looking for evidence to support what we already believe, in an effort to make us feel better, oftentimes. Have you ever made an illusory correlation between two things that you thought were similar but are not? What is an example of the hindsight bias, etc.? So that will do it for this chapter, and I'll see you next time. And I'll go to Zoom here and out.